Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anthony Froggatt. I'm a Senior Research Fellow here at Chatham House. Welcome to those in the room in London, and welcome to those joining us online. We have a quite large audience, so yeah, really grateful that you've spared the time to join us today. We're here in this event to discuss combating climate change, NATO's role in building climate resilience. I work in the Environment Society programme. This is a topic very close to our hearts. And it's, at least from my perspective, it's obvious why. We are seeing the impacts of climate change as never before. I mean, just to give a few examples, in the UK, we saw that June just gone was the highest temperature ever recorded. We're seeing global sea temperatures at unprecedented levels. More broadly, we're seeing wildfires overwhelming Canada, and the consequences are spread across the continent into North America. Reports of this year's monsoon in South Asia could drive even more intense and devastating flooding than what we saw last year in Pakistan and India. And just remember that the impacts aren't just immediate, they cascade across borders. So where we see an impact somewhere, the consequences may be felt in a different country or even a different continent, given the linked supply chains and the movement of people. So I think we're all recognising this, none more than NATO, that has recognised the importance of climate change and the need to strengthen its abilities in relation to climate shocks. And an alliance they have been preparing for safeguarding the issues around security challenges and acknowledging the impact across the whole of its sphere of operations. And in particular, NATO's 2022 strategic concept set out the ambitions to integrate climate change across the three core tasks of collective defence, crisis management and cooperative security. But in that context, but what we're seeing is the challenge that climate change is really threatening the ability to address these really quite crucial issues, as is some of the key issues that also are front and centre in terms of NATO's mind, nonetheless, than, of course, the situation of Ukraine. So what we're here today to discuss, just ahead of the NATO summit taking place in Vilnius next week, is just how can NATO build up climate resilience across its internal structures and across its member states. And I'm very delighted that we have three really esteemed speakers for you today. We have Ambassador David Angel, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to NATO. We have Lieutenant General Richard Nugi, who is the Climate Change and Sustainability Lead within the UK Ministry of Defence. And we have Ahmed Van Rij, who's a Research Fellow in the International Security Programme, and she'll be presenting findings of a Chatham House report that was published today on this very topic. So I'm going to hand over to them, and in terms of how we're going to operate today, we have lots of people online, so please do start putting in your questions. We then have our, 100-odd people within the room. I will come to you and try and group the questions. I'd like to remind everyone that this is on the record, and it is being recorded, so please bear that in mind in terms of your questions, but also panellists in terms of your answers. So we'll have 30 minutes sort of interaction from the panel, and then we're going to open it up to everyone else in the room and online. So if I can turn to the Ambassador first. Obviously from Canada, Canada's played an absolutely important role in terms of raising the profile domestically in terms of climate security, and by setting up a centre of excellence on climate change and security. So maybe you could just talk about what you think the priorities are for NATO going forward in terms of climate security, and are we expecting to see anything on this issue in Vilnius next week?
Anthony, thank you for hosting us and for the questions. You talked about the wildfire issue in Canada. I was there 2 weeks ago. Had this discussion been taking place in Toronto or Ottawa or Montreal, we would all have had to struggle with really appalling air quality, acrid air coming in. And that's a reminder to Canadians that the climate change issue is real and it's with us. It's not an issue for the future, it's one we have to deal with now. And unfortunately, in, I think, every allied country, population, citizens are seeing from their own experience that this is an immediate issue. It's not a new issue for NATO. NATO's been working on environmental issues for 50 years. We've had a green defense agenda for quite a long time, but what is new is the urgency and the intensity with which we are addressing the issue. Anthony, you referred to the strategic concept that was agreed by leaders last year. The strategic concept is the apex document for NATO from which all of our defense planning and political work follows. And it's worth just pausing to look at how the issue was framed. And I won't read it at length, but the key sentence in the strategic concept is that climate change is a defining challenge of our time with a profound impact on Allied security. It is a crisis and threat multiplier. It can exacerbate conflict, fragility, and geopolitical competition. And there's more. But it makes the point that this is not a subsidiary issue for NATO. This is absolutely front and center. The response by NATO is commensurate to the challenge. We have benefited from extraordinary leadership from our Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, who in a previous incarnation was a UN Special Envoy for Climate Change, and also before becoming Norway's Prime Minister was Norway's Environment Minister. So we've had 9 years of leadership from a SecGen who is extraordinarily strong in general, but also deeply, deeply committed to these issues. And what allies have done recently is, first of all, I think it was back in 2021, foreign ministers adopted a climate change and security agenda. And then a few months later, leaders adopted a climate change and security action plan. And so between the two, you have a frame for NATO's work going forward. NATO as NATO, in other words, the organization, but also 31, we hope soon, 32 allies. And in terms of the priorities, the action plan breaks work down into 4 areas. One is awareness, and the issue there is simply the imperative that we understand the geostrategic implications of climate change. We Canadians see the impact in our north, where warming is having an impact at a much greater pace than most other places in the world. But we see it with sea level rise. We see it, it's going to have a profound impact in security terms, and we need to understand that. A second area of priority is adaptation. Climate change will affect every aspect of how militaries operate. If you take sea level rise, for example, the areas we use as our ports are going to be affected. If you look at how air pressure changes, the way we fly our aircraft is going to change. So there are a vast array of implications that we need to absorb. There's also the important fact that as our societies struggle with the impact of climate change, and increased flooding is one example, the air quality issue, the wildfire issue we talked about is one example, our armed forces will be called upon more and more to provide a domestic support function. And it's an essential role, and it's one they're very good at, but there's an opportunity cost to everything, and it means they're not available to do other things. Third, there's a mitigation piece. There's no escaping the fact that militaries are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to find a way to reduce those emissions without impairing the effectiveness of our armed forces. Tanks emit, aircraft emit, warships emit, our military bases emit. When we assist countries outside of the Atlantic area, even setting up camp has a major environmental footprint impact. And so we need to rise to the challenge of reducing the emissions without impairing our military effectiveness. And then fourth is the key issue of outreach and partnerships. We can't do this alone. I mean, NATO is committed to being the gold standard organization as regards climate and security, but we play a supporting role with regard to climate more generally. And even within the climate and security space, we need to work with industry if we are going to find ways of reducing the emissions of our military equipment. We need to work with the think tank community and with academia to find solutions. We need to work with partners outside of NATO, including Australia, New Zealand, for example, that are very, very aware of climate change impacts in their own region, as we are with regard to the impact in the Caribbean, for example. And so working with partners is absolutely crucial. Anthony, you mentioned the Climate Change Center of Excellence. This is an initiative that Prime Minister Trudeau announced at Madrid last year. The process for setting up NATO Centers of Excellence is not fast, so we're not quite there yet. But we are very, very close, and the response from allies has been superb. What these are, we have almost 30 centers of excellence at NATO, and what they are is entities outside the chain of command, outside the formal decision-making process, where we can do creative thinking. And so the Center of Excellence on Climate Change and Security that's going to be set up in Montreal imminently will provide a platform where we can work with partners, we can work with industry, we can make sure that we're bringing as many partners to bear in taking forward the four agenda I spoke to. In terms of Vilnius, major summit coming up around the corner. The summit we had in Madrid last year was about defining a new vision for NATO, and that vision was captured largely in the strategic concept. Vilnius is about delivering on that vision, and of course we'll be very focused on Ukraine, but as the Secretary General has said, you can't choose between the priorities, and we've seen with President Putin's weaponization of energy, weaponization of food, that there are direct linkages, and we in the alliance need to reduce our energy dependence on carbons for security reasons, just as we have to reduce critical mineral dependencies. So what we will see at Vilnius, I expect, we will have another high-level dialogue, as the Secretary General is committed to doing on the margins of each summit. This is one way of making sure that we're advancing our work. We will also see the release of the second climate change and security assessment, impact assessment. The first was issued in 2022. It's worth a read, and it catalogs what NATO needs to do in regard to mitigation and adaptation, for example.
Great. Well, I look forward to that, in particular seeing how it's changed over the last year. I mean, given, as you highlighted, the extent to which we're seeing the impacts of climate change. Richard, if I could turn to you. UK, maybe I'm biased. I think we've seen the UK within Ministry of Defence looking at climate change as a significant issue. Maybe you could just talk through how you have seen climate change become embedded within thinking, and maybe touch upon these four areas: awareness, adaptation, mitigation, and partnership, to the extent to which the UK is along similar lines.
Thank you very much indeed, Anthony. And I think just hearing the ambassador there shows how much we are in unison, I think, with NATO and strongly supporting what they're doing. Sort of how has the UK gone about it? I think, and some of this will be a sort of repetition in a slightly different way to what the ambassador said, but there's a really important, if you like, base assumption against all of this, which is that ministries of defence, NATO, our allies are all there really for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to protect the nation or protect the alliance, and that must come first. And so military capability must be upheld, and therefore we must look at ways that embracing what is happening as a result of climate change, in terms of equipment, and I'll come on to that in a bit more, must enhance our military capability rather than diminish it. And we've got to overcome, actually, and a lot of what in the UK we did was trying to overcome all those sceptics who would turn around and say, if you like, a green navy is by definition a less good navy. I think there's a really important point that actually we should be working with the grain of the organisation, and the grain of the organisation is that actually we think in terms of improving our military capability at all times, and trying to be the best we possibly can as a military force. But I think the other side of it is identifying opportunities. And there's a huge area of society which just sees climate change as a negative. It's all doom and gloom. It's all about the damage that it's doing. And of course, it is doing huge damage. And actually just, there was some stuff in the papers today about, I'll just quote, since April, the global sea ice is 1 million square kilometres reduced. The Antarctic this year is 2.5 million square miles less than average. This is going to have a profound effect on us as people, but it will also have a profound effect on how we operate. But there are opportunities. And I think one of the things that the UK MOD has done is look for those opportunities. So there's geopolitical opportunities, new partnerships could come about as a result of climate change, new trade, new areas of the world where we might be able to reduce the amount of time it takes to get from A to B, if you use the Arctic as an example. So there's geopolitical opportunities. In order to combat climate change, there are very significant changes in the innovation space and in the way that energy is being looked at, and we need to embrace that. So new technologies coming along, technologies that make us more self-sufficient, technologies that make us more resilient as forces. And whether that is energy or materials or recycling and therefore saving cost, which is another great opportunity. There are opportunities of saving cost just by looking at different ways of doing things. Then actually we can look at improving our equipment for the same cost or if you like, getting more bang for your buck. And then there's a third piece, if you like, which is about tactics. And it's one of those sadnesses that in Afghanistan and Iraq, a very large number of our soldiers were killed on combat logistic patrols, on resupplying our bases. But the thing that we were resupplying most of was water and fuel, primarily fuel, actually. And so if we can become more self-sufficient in our bases, in our deployed bases, either through the use of micronuclear, as one example, which companies are working on both in the US and in Europe, or potentially through solar or through some other mechanism, there are lots out there, then actually you reduce the number of combat logistic patrols. Now, that has three effects, actually. It saves lives, because we lost a lot that way. It saves money. The US, I think, were quoted as saying that a litre of diesel to Bagram airfield in just north of Kabul a gallon cost $500. So that's $150 a litre, give or take. And then the third piece, which is often not recognised, is that each of those combat logistic patrols, for example, had armour, had infantry and had aviation, making sure that it got through. All of that could have been used on the front line if it wasn't supporting combat logistic patrols. So this is an example where actually we're looking at, and the MOD is looking very closely, at all these opportunities where you could improve what we do, make us more resilient, make us more self-sufficient. And out of that comes both mitigation, and we're looking at how we can mitigate. The Royal Air Force has declared that they're going to be net zero by 2040. They have to go down a route of, sustainable aviation fuel of one form or another in order to be able to achieve that, because the vast majority of their emissions are from their fuel. So you've got there an example of we must embrace it in order both to meet a net zero, but actually sustainable aviation fuel is cleaner for the engines. It needs less maintenance, therefore will be cheaper in the long run. And if we can get it to a level that it's the same cost as existing fuel, then you can, which may well be possible by 2040, then you will end up with just a better product, which is better for our air forces. So there's mitigation, there's adaptation. Are we looking at Canada? I think has been very forward-thinking in hardening some of the hulls of some of their warships to go into the Arctic. Any navy that feels it has a duty to go into the Arctic for keeping free trade open during when those come through ought to be doing the same, I would argue. And we're not talking about hardening existing ships, we're talking about designing new ships. So there's a whole lot about adaptation. And then the final piece is about sort of climate and security, both awareness and outreach, and I completely agree with the Ambassador. Awareness is so important, not just to look at what is happening around the world, but look at the cascading effects of the sort of energy security, water security, food security, border security, and of course our citizens' personal security. All of those need to be thought about, and the cascading effects between them, which will inevitably, I think, lead to greater tensions and potentially conflict. And I'll finish by saying something that the UK Defence Minister said up in COP26 to the NATO Secretary General, which is, it is very often the militaries who will have to pick up the pieces when the world starts to become more contentious. And so the militaries need to understand that in a way that means that they can resolve the issues because they understand them.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, lots to think about. Some questions are coming in. But I'll turn to Amida first. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, Chatham House published a paper. You're one of the co-authors. Others are in the room. Preparing NATO for climate-related security challenges. Maybe you could just talk through some of these conclusions, and then our other panelists could respond, things that they'd like to pick up on, and then we'll open up the floor.
Great.
Please.
Thanks very much, Anthony. I'll just give a very high-level overview of the report and kind of our basis of the argument, and then perhaps we can go into a bit more detail on it during the Q&A and the discussion. The report, which I'm personally very excited about, is a result of a joint Environmental Societies and International Security Programme here at Chatham House. My co-authors, Adam Farhan and Sina Cosman, who are somewhere in the room, and I have worked on this for the past year or so. It's part of a Cascades project, which is a wider project looking at the cascading impacts of climate change, funded by the EU Horizon 2020 programme. What we did was look at the most effective levers that NATO has or needs to develop to be able to effectively address climate-related security risks. And rather than concentrating solely on why this is important, we focused on how NATO can do this. As the Ambassador outlined very much at the start, NATO is not starting from scratch on this, and there is a lot that has already been happening in this space, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. And there's also a lot that can be learned from other partners and from other initiatives that have been developed either from the UN or the EU and others. The climate change and the climate change and security impact assessment of last year does a really good job as well of showing the climate change impact on NATO, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing the 2023 edition. But our starting point really has been to try and think about these issues from a military perspective. So to the General's point, how can we enhance capabilities while also tackling and adapting to climate change? To give you the bottom line up front, by increasing military effectiveness and strengthening the resilience of NATO operations, structures and capabilities, NATO can also adapt to climate change and prepare itself to respond to climate-related security risks. As we've heard before, this is not a zero-sum game. An investment in climate change adaptation and mitigation can also strengthen the alliance and make it more resilient. And we really have to get away from this idea that it's an either-or choice. It is not. These issues are intrinsically linked and connected. What I will say is, while we've tried to take this from a military point of view, and I think that's very important, we do still need to recognize that this needs to happen at pace. Climate change is already here, as we've heard, and it is already impacting us. And we all know what the global ramifications will be of not meeting the 1.5 degree global warming target as per the Paris Agreement. So for us, the absolute priority has to be building consensus on of the importance of the climate security agenda. I can go into lots of detail specifically about what NATO can do, and I'd be delighted to do so later on. But ultimately, until all allies are agreed on why this is important and how important it is, action will always remain limited and stilted. The 2022 strategic concept that was mentioned and the action plan are a really good start. But our point of view is that to make a real difference, the alliance needs to go further. Beyond the consensus building point that I was making, we see three priority areas for NATO. The first is to strengthen political and institutional structures, for example, by investing in cultural change within the alliance. The second is to strengthen mechanisms for anticipating climate risks, for example, by having stronger climate risk assessments that can then be used in the NATO defence planning processes. And the third is to build more resilient operations, to the example that the General was giving earlier, by reducing energy consumption at bases. Now you'll ask me, great, how? Just to give you a flavour, I'll give you a couple of examples, but first I want to pick up on the General's point earlier on the use of microgrids at bases. So these are locally run independent sources that can generate power or can generate renewable energy on site. And to me, this is a really good example of a win-win situation or a win-win solution, where on the one hand, it will reduce energy consumption, but in the other, it is then also less likely that the base will be affected if the power supply were to be cut or somehow affected by either malicious activity or by extreme weather events. So to me, this really kind of shows the win-win situation that we were talking about earlier. The General mentioned how resupply convoys are a huge weakness in any kind of military operation. And to put a stat to that, in 2007, in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was on average 1 casualty for every 24 resupply convoys. That's a huge number of casualties just for resupply. So if we can diminish that, as the General put far more eloquently than me, that has a real impact on personnel, on capabilities, etc. The other thing I want to highlight is this question around the political structures and addressing the institutional challenges that we need to look at. And really here the point I'd like to make is the need to invest in cultural change inside of the alliance. Throughout the course of this project, it's sometimes felt like we've been speaking to two different audiences. One who, very much like the panel here, is very much bought into the agenda, gets why this is important, gets why we need to do this. The other is saying, well, sure, but I've got Russia in my backyard, and I've got a hugely polluting tank, so how am I going to do this? This is just not my priority, which is a fair point. And so there's this really important point around strengthening the institutional and political mechanisms within the alliance and to bring allies all up to scratch. One quite ambitious idea that we have for that, which is ambitious, I will recognize, is to, as we're talking about the 2% of defense spending, of GDP on defense spend, which is the pledge that was set in 2014, that pledge will expire in 2024 and is currently being renegotiated. What the allies could do is include a climate-related target as part of that. So currently there's already a 20% of procurement, part of that 2% pledge. Why not add a climate-related target to that? Focus specifically on resilience and adaptation measures. That's just one idea. It is more difficult and it's politically more sensitive, but that is something that could have a lot of impact if it were to be successful. That's to give you a flavor. Perhaps I'll just finally say that we recognize that we're having this discussion in a really difficult context. There's Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, there's ongoing provocations by China, and ultimately there's always going to be these really difficult trade-offs and a balance that needs to be struck between addressing immediate threats and longer-term challenges. We're talking about Russia today versus tackling China in the future, as well as climate change. But again, as I was saying earlier, these issues are intrinsically connected and we cannot separate them out. And by tackling one, we are also indirectly tackling the other one. Having said that, we recognize that this is very difficult. There is a constraint on capacity and resources to just dedicate to this agenda. And so to try and address some of that and to make it a little bit easier, we've divided our recommendations into 3 categories. 1, quick and easy wins, the low-hanging fruit that frankly really shouldn't take too much effort. 2nd, the medium-term successes. And finally, the difficult stuff, but that if it's done, and if it's done well, could have a lot of impact. And I think the climate target fits into that bucket. And ultimately doing those things will allow NATO to continue to deliver on its 3 core tasks. I very much invite you to take a look at the report and the recommendations as well. There's a lot more to say, and I'm sure a lot more will come up, but I'll stop for now.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Very rich series of presentations. If I could pick up on one thing that you said and then turn to the panelists and maybe you could pick up on any others. But the 3 areas you mentioned is strengthening political and institutions, more resilient actions, etc., which I think we covered quite a lot. But the anticipating climate risks as a 3rd area. I don't know, Ambassador, if you have how this is being done. I mean, you talked about the report coming out, but it clearly is a challenge of our times. Is unprecedented changes, as we've all heard, in terms of the impact of climate change. How do we go about anticipating what we think is going to be the situation next year, never mind 5 years or 10 years from now? So what is NATO doing in this area?
Well, thank you, Anthony, for the chance to respond again. And the report that Armida just spoke to really is excellent. A couple of points in response to both colleagues. First, just to acknowledge how important it is that Lieutenant General Nuji's position actually exists. It's not the norm. Kudos to the UK and to MOD for creating a coordination position at the 3-star level. It really is important, and it's a practice that I think all the other allies, including Canada, ought to be following. The comments that were made on mitigation, I agree with entirely. The point is there is a recognition that we have to do this differently. And so one of the responses by the Secretary General, for example, is to begin work on a new analytical methodology for greenhouse gas emissions by the military. We need to figure out how we can work with industry, design military kit that is more responsive to climate changes, but as the General emphasized, without in any way impairing military effectiveness. And this is an area where Canada and the UK can actually do a lot of work together, because one of the areas of leadership that we're both embarking on is in each of us hosting one of the offices, one of the 2 offices, and there's an office in Tallinn as well as part of the UK office of the Defence Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, which is NATO's major response to try to ensure that we, as an alliance, maintain our technological edge. This will be a key contributor to the development of the new technologies we're talking about, and it's an area where Canada and the UK jointly are playing a leadership role. On the report, as I said, really is excellent, and I agree with the premise that we need to do more to adjust the culture. It's happening, but it doesn't happen overnight. The language in the strategic concept that I read at the outset and that you referred to, Anthony, is agreed language. The way that NATO works, and the strategic concept was negotiated by the 31, I guess we weren't quite 31 at the time, 30 then allies. And the way that NATO works, I've been doing multilateral diplomacy for 30 years now, and NATO really is unique in a number of ways, and one is the decision-making process. Ministers meet either foreign ministers or defense ministers, either every 6 or 7 weeks. We have summits frequently. We had 3 in 2022. We usually have at least one each year. And what this means is we have a decision-making process through which issues can be introduced and really, really churned, with decisions taken as and when they're needed. And so this is not a situation where we've done climate and security, thank you, and we're moving on. We can bring in new aspects, and we can continue to progress. And the decisions that are taken are fed by a network of committees on which all the allies are present. And so what that means in practice is that in each and every allied capital, the civilian administration, the military work together. And so when leaders take a decision, there is complete buy-in across the alliance, both civilian and military. So the climate change, culture change is happening, and it will continue. In terms of the Defence Investment Pledge and 2%, first of all, I agree entirely that the Defence Investment Pledge needs to align with the strategic concept. This is the threat assessment that leaders endorsed, and how we invest our defence expenditure ought to be a reflection of that, and that includes the language on climate change. On the issue of specific targets, I just, a very slight cautionary note in that, first of all, if there's a proliferation of targets, it's very hard to do justice to them. But the bigger point is that while NATO, we expect, will play a crucial role on climate and security, every one of the 31, we hope soon 32 allies, has signed up to the UN Framework Convention, and it's through that process that we sign up to our commitments. And I think most allies, even those most strongly committed to action in this area, would want to avoid a situation where we're entering into different commitments in different fora. What we're doing is implementing the security side of the broader commitments we've entered into through the UN process as 31 parties to that process who happen to be allies.
Great. Thank you. Richard, do you have any quick responses before I open it up and then commit?
So just a couple, if I may. Firstly, that there is obviously a potential tension between a national requirement and a NATO requirement. And if NATO goes too hard in saying you must, it might clash with a national requirement. And therefore, we just need to be completely alive to that. And in the UK, we're going down a sectoral approach to mitigation because that is the way the country's going. And we're trying to tie in with other government departments and the way that the country is going. So we just need to be slightly alive to that. How that can be overcome, I think, is by NATO, and I would dearly love NATO to do this, or I'm not quite sure how, to set standards that have to be met by countries. And those standards would be, of course, completely compatible with where we're trying to get to. It may not be a terribly good example for some, but the idea of a single fuel policy that NATO came up with, it took quite a long time to get through, but actually it was a single fuel policy for the whole of NATO, which all NATO agreed to try and abide by. That is just an example of what we might be able to do in the future. And then anticipating climate risks, it is really difficult because it is so complex. But we should be using what NATO is doing in terms of trying to design a climate intelligence, if you like, coming from those who are deployed to try and understand what's happening in the climate, in the environment in which they are deployed, to feed back to try and improve the models. And so it almost becomes a reporting of deployed troops wherever in the world they're deployed to say what's happening to the local environment, and then NATO can start to build a bigger picture and a more effective picture, particularly if those troops have been put in areas which are under conflict because climate change is causing so much tension.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm cheating, but just the comment on the single fuel policy. The underlying point is we need to address climate change in a way that reinforces interoperability as well.
Yeah, completely agree.
I'll meet it very, very quickly, and then I'm going to open it up.
I just want to come back quickly on 2 points, well, 3 points. First, I completely agree on the single fuel policy point. I think, or rather the interoperability point. Having said that, I think going forward, we will also need to look at the single fuel policy because ultimately that's not going to be sustainable.
Correct.
However, at the moment, I don't think we're anywhere near where alternative fuels, more sustainable fuels, are ready for deployment. They're hugely energy intensive to develop, so we're not quite there yet. 2 points, one on credibility, one on standards. So just on the new emissions methodology, which has been proposed and is being developed, I think this is a really positive development. But I think there's also a point here around that NATO needs to build credibility and legitimacy as an actor in this space. And so there's been a lot of kind of back and forth about this methodology and what that's going to look like, whether it's going to be public or not, etc. What we would say to that is it doesn't per se needs to be public because there are sensitivity constraints around that. I get it. But there does need to be an external independent method of verification of the methodology to make sure that it is sound. And I think that will also help build NATO's credibility and legitimacy in this space. The second point, very quickly, on the standardization agreements, I think this is a really, really good point. And they take forever to develop and to kind of put together. And so they're very resource intensive. But when we have them, they're very useful. And so one of the things we're proposing, again, in the recommendations bit of the report, is to use standardization agreements to have resilience baselines for all future infrastructure that NATO may develop or build or construct, etc. Again, longer term, more difficult to do, but that could be a good way of using those standardization agreements to build in resilience from the onset when developing new infrastructure.
Great, thank you. So, questions? Oh, I knew there's going to be a lot. I've got 31 online as well. So I'm going to take them in groups of 3 if I can. I'm going to ask people to respond very quickly so that we can try and get 2 or 3 rounds. So maybe we can start at the front and do this front row 3 first. So the young gentleman slightly older gentleman, and then the lady there.
Thank you.
And if you could give your names as well, that's always helpful.
Shay Mitchell.
From?
UK.
Okay.
Nice to meet you all. On the point about micro-nuclear technology, and you've talked a lot about the impact of Fukushima and how it's affected our view of nuclear energy. Do you think that is actually realistic to push for nuclear energy, considering the darker image that nuclear has as a source of energy?
Great, thank you.
This young gentleman's from Alberta, Canada, and the reason I'm here in London is because my house looked like it was going to catch on fire. So,
really?
So that draws me to your comment about pace. And I'd like our panelists to address pace. I hear the word pace. I left home because it looked like it was going to be on fire. I'm wondering what it will take to increase pace. When I hear about 2040, I'm thinking, that seems like eons from now. We're going to do something by 2040. That doesn't seem to make terribly much sense. And then I hear about multilateral diplomacy. I sure hope that NATO doesn't deploy its military side with multilateral discussions, because I don't think it would be fast enough. And I think that that's some of the strength which NATO has, a command structure that says, we got to deal with it now, rather than in some distant future. So perhaps you could help me with that.
Thank you. And then the lady here, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's Dr. Jihan Baban. I am a chartered environmentalist, and I am a president of the Iraqi Environment and Health Society UK. As you know, there is no specific pattern for the impact of climate change globally. This is going to be a problem, ranging from floods in Europe to high temperatures, desertification, sandstorm, and water scarcity in MENA and Africa, especially in Iraq. The question is, what mechanisms NATO members use to adapt their policies and strategies to meet climate change and achieve sustainable security objectives? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there's three questions there. If I could just add on to some of the clustering, some of the questions that are online about technologies, the question about micro-nuclear, questions about running warships on different technologies, is this feasible, electrolysis or osmosis, and in some ways the role of renewable energy. I think you touched upon that, some of the importance in terms of solar, but maybe you could, if there's anything else that you could add in relation to other hopeful technologies or technologies that may play a role in the future. So the pace question as well.
Yeah, three questions. On nuclear energy, the political debate on nuclear energy differs across the 31 countries of the alliance, and certainly it's a nuclear alliance, and we're heavily engaged in the technologies that are part of that. There's no barrier to deepening in the engagement on that. There may be just political discussions within each country, but that's what the political process is about. On pace, the urgency is understood, but what we are trying to do is really, really, really hard. I mean, you're basically redesigning how major pieces of military equipment operate. And that is going to take time. It's going to take work with industry. It's going to require that demand signals to industry be sent in a very clear way. And you're talking about the redesign of military hardware, which very often takes upward of 10 years just in the normal design cycle. So this is not an area where we can say that there will be immediate change. But the work is beginning immediately, and the framework is there, and NATO deploys when NATO agrees internally that deployment is necessary. We're not multilateralizing that. We're not changing the way that we operate. On the question with regard to military operations, one of the areas where there is work being done immediately is to make sure that in the planning of all of our military operations and our missions and our activities, climate change is factored in. And that's being done now. And where we work with partners, as we do in Iraq, Canada had the privilege of commanding for its first 2 years the NATO mission in Iraq. We work very closely with the host governments. The mission that we have in Iraq is a training mission, and it's a capacity building mission. It's not a military operation in that sense. but we work extremely closely with the Iraqi authorities. And if this is identified as an area where we can help Iraq as partner develop capacity, then that is something that we would be very open to doing.
Richard, answer them very briefly. I'm going to add another question for you because it said, interesting to learn the diesel figure that you gave, the $500 a gallon. Any idea about the cost of fresh water?
I don't have a figure for the cost of fresh water, but what it goes to exactly the point that the ambassador's just been making, actually, which is that the very first thing that our operations need to do is understand what impact they are having on the environment. We did a study in Mali with our troops in Mali, and were frankly horrified by the length of the supply chain for fuel, but more importantly, the length of supply chain for bottled water. And the number of trucks that was coming in with bottled water. And what happened to the bottles? Well, we wanted to recycle them, but that proved to be close on impossible at the time. And therefore they were, they were a real problem for us, all these bottled water. There's a Dutch company that can produce 1,000 litres of water a day, that's enough for a company, a company of infantry, from the air. So the new technologies are coming along. They are coming. And we've just got to have confidence that those technologies will get bigger and bigger and more effective and more cost effective. Another point, just to emphasize something about pace. The first vehicle that I commanded, which was it's an armour fighting vehicle, 432. Doesn't matter what it is. It was older than me when I first commanded it. It is still on the battlefield. Hardware tends to last a very long time indeed. Our aircraft carriers, we absolutely expect to be there in 2050, 2060. And what we're not going to do, I would suggest, unless some really new technology comes along, is change the engines on our aircraft carriers. So we've got to find ways round trying to reduce our emissions from our aircraft carriers without changing the engines. And that probably means a change in fuel, and that probably means much more investment in new maritime fuels. I noticed there's a conference this week on new maritime fuels across the world. So looking at those new technologies, nuclear is but one. It's a completely different type of nuclear. It's extremely safe. And it's being developed in the US and the UK at the moment, and I think is a real opportunity for us for deployed troops. And then finally, in terms of military operations, sustainability, understanding what we can do to make our operations more sustainable. And I mentioned just energy, but actually there's many other ways of doing it. Whether it's geothermal, whether it's boreholes, whatever is correct in the environment, and what we don't want to do is deprive the local communities. By putting too many boreholes in, we'll deprive the local community, so that would not work. But finding ways of using new technology to make ourselves more self-sufficient and more sustainable must be the answer. And I think the technology is moving at pace and coming on. I think that is where the pace is going to be delivered, is by new technologies just ramping up very fast.
But as you said, the challenge of phasing out older technologies is the same. Amida, do you want to come in very quickly, because I don't want to get another round, but again, I'm going to throw in another question to you. Given your nationality, I think you can answer this. NATO coordination with actions in the EU. What about a new task force dedicated to resilience? Will NATO use this channel to deal with the issue?
So to tackle that last one first, while it's fresh in my mind, a off-the-record quote from someone who I spoke to about this basically said there's a lot of coordination, there isn't a lot of cooperation, and I'd be delighted to be told that I'm wrong by the ambassador if that's not the case. But EU-NATO cooperation on climate security issues could be stronger than what it currently is. There are political issues which we don't need to go into now, which hampers that. They recently established a task force looking at resilience, specifically of critical national infrastructure. Climate security is part of that agenda, but it doesn't mean that the task force is solely focused on resilience. And I think this is a very good suggestion, and I'm pretty sure we have something about that in there. I quickly want to address the tech point. I agree. I think there's a lot of really interesting technological innovations that we're going to see kind of being put in use over the next few years and decades, and that's really exciting. I think it'll also be really interesting to see what's going to come out of Diana, which is a defense innovation accelerator, joint with NATO and Imperial and a bunch of other academic institutions. And I think that will really be able to put some meat to the bones of some of these technological advances. What I will say is that there is a limitation to tech, and tech isn't going to provide the solution to every political problem. And that goes back to my earlier point around building consensus on this issue. And just quickly on the pace question, which I think is really important. Again, that goes back to my consensus point, and we know, as we've heard, that NATO is doing a lot on this front. I also think there's something about the politics of it versus what the international staff can just get on with and do and implement quietly in the background. But they do require resources and capacity, etc. And so I do think we need to see increased funding and resources for the Emerging Security Challenges Division. We've highlighted this in the report. They are responsible for designing some of the climate security strategies within NATO, as well as funding for the Science for Peace and Security program, specifically to address climate-related challenges. And what we've seen from previous programs funded under this initiative is that it also helps enable cooperation between allies and partners who are not NATO by definition. So I think, again, I think there's a lot of opportunities.
Great. More questions? Take from maybe the middle block here. Got 3 quick ones, and then I'll take that gentleman there just because his hand went up so fast. And please keep them very short, and we'll see if we can get another round in.
Hi, Hugo Barker from Imperial College. It's wonderful to read the report. It is fantastic to read it this morning, and to see the mention of Diana and the mention of Diana on this panel. What role do you see Diana playing in the innovation of climate technology? Do you see it playing more of a use of mitigation within military context, or do you see a more just geostrategic context where you could innovate around technologies such as fusion and these kind of deeper things that may not have military capability? Thank you.
Diagonally backwards, do you want to just pass it? Yeah.
Ambassador, do you see a role for NATO expanding its deterrence role and its diplomatic sphere of influence to discourage any state from invading another, as we know that war is one of the most damaging impacts on the climate, and the climate is the greatest risk to NATO countries?
Thank you. And then the gentleman, again, diagonally back. That's great.
My name is Kehinde Shudipo, International Student Relation. Now, my question is on, we know that NATO has a foundational military tendency, and then we're not talking about climate change and how NATO can be a climate resilience. Now, my question is, won't this create a strategic imbalance, drain and redirect the economic resources of NATO, and as well as, aren't we sensing a kind of productivity in all of this discussion? Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally here.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ewan Grant, I'm a former UK law enforcement intelligence analyst who's worked on World Bank EU capacity building programs in climate-affected countries, Somalia, Yemen, Jordan. My question is, which organizations, widely defined, are cooperating enthusiastically and energetically with NATO, and by implications, which are not? I've read between the lines of Dr. Van Ridge's comments about NATO-EU. Thank you.
Thank you. So international cooperation. And maybe again, I'll throw in a couple more questions. What are the prospects of NATO supporting the designation of ecocide as an international crime, which I think is it maybe builds on one of the other questions. Happy US Independence Day was one of the questions, which is very nice.
Thank you from Canada.
There you go. And I guess quite a few questions along the lines of climate change has led to a humanitarian disaster, regional tension and violence. What mechanism has NATO put in place to curb these concerns? So the sort of the wider questions about addressing the immediate impacts. Can we start and go back along the line? That's Armida. Can we start with you?
Mm-hmm. Perhaps the first thing to say, I think, is that we need to be quite careful in terms of where NATO can make a difference and where it can't and perhaps shouldn't step into the space. So I don't think NATO should address every single aspect of climate-related security issues, and I don't think it can do that very effectively. And I think there's a risk that by stepping into that space, it would take agency away from other actors who are better placed to respond, thinking, for example, specifically of climate-related migration. And this is where the working with partners and the international cooperation point really comes in. The EU is a key partner. We've heard about the Indo-Pacific partners who are going to be heavily affected and already are by climate change. So there's a lot of kind of lessons learned and platforming of knowledge that can be done there. So I think that goes to the eco side point and the international organizations point. On Diana, so the beauty of Diana obviously is that it's dual use. And I think we just need to bear that in mind on the extent to which it should just focus on mitigation and kind of deeper intensive technologies. I think that will also depend on prioritization. And to some extent, again, that will depend on the political kind of trickle down, what's decided at the top level in terms of prioritization. I'll leave it at that.
Most of these questions are not really for me to answer. I think the ambassador will make a much better answer than I will. But I think Ahmed has already said about Diana. Diana's really important because it offers, I think really for the first time, a really innovative approach that NATO wants to take. Of course it's to try and find solutions to some of NATO's problems in terms of mitigation and adaptation. But to the point, no solution is likely to be just military or just civilian. We've got to look at the intersection between the two and see how we can adapt one to the other. So I think Diana is a really good opportunity to look at both dual use. And I was going to pick up on the last point about human disaster relief. We should be really clear that every academic document that I've seen in the last 2 or 3 years says that militaries are going to be more involved in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. And whether that's at home, which we call military assistance to civil authorities, or whether that's abroad, which we tend to call humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, doesn't matter. We're going to be more involved. And if you look at what's happened, for example, in Australia, and I appreciate it's not a NATO country, but in Australia they've had a year of COVID, followed by a year of fires, followed by a year of floods. The military has been fully committed to that. You look at Pakistan, a third of the country underwater, the military was fully committed to trying to solve that issue. That's absolutely where the militaries are being sent. It's not particularly good for military training in terms of our primary role, but it is what is happening. And that is what we need. And so we need to be absolutely alive to what are the best practices that we can take from that? What are the equipments that we need for that? What are the cooperations and collaborations that we can do? And so for just one example, in the Caribbean, the French and the British working together to try and solve the problems rather than working independently.
Thank you. Ambassador, you've got a few for you to answer.
A few questions, a few minutes.
2 minutes. Yeah.
Diana is potentially extremely important in this space. But it's not the only actor in this space. The Center of Excellence can be extremely useful in convening industry and academia and thinking through some of these issues. But we also have other parts of the NATO enterprise. We have the Alliance Command Transformation in Norfolk, for example, which thinks about warfighting in the next century and does a lot of work on innovation themselves. What we have to do is harness all of the bits and pieces in the NATO enterprise that can work in this space. Diana is still in the design stage, as is the Center of Excellence, and I'm sure that some of these climate change issues will be designed into how they move forward. On deterrence, NATO's role is, NATO is first of all a defensive alliance exclusively for the Euro-Atlantic area. And so when leaders talk about defending every inch of NATO territory, we take that very seriously. One of the outcomes from the summit in Vilnius next week will be the development of very robust new defense plans that will put a very strong emphasis on collective defense. Our core tasks include crisis management, working with other countries to advance security, but we don't have a deterrence role outside of the Euro-Atlantic area. And I don't see NATO taking that on. The Washington Treaty is very clear. We exist for the defense of the allies and their populations and territory. In terms of working with other organizations, we work with many, UN, AU, but none is more important than the European Union. They really are a strategic partner for NATO. We have seen that on Ukraine. The two organizations have worked hand in glove, using respective tools and remits. NATO does not work on sanctions. So Canada, UK, US, non-EU allies have worked very closely to align behind the EU's work on sanctions, because they do sanctions. We do hard defense. We've worked in our respective lanes and worked extremely closely and I would say effectively. It's not always a seamless partnership. It can't be. We do have some frictions, and Armida alluded to those, and those come from outside, and we can't solve them internally. But we work around those, and first of all, we are very encouraging, we Canadians, of the EU taking on a more robust defense role. But what we really want to see, as the NATO-EU partnership comes closer, is to see it drill down and do more practical things, and this is an area where we can do that. Designation of ecocide, that's not us. Armina's point about horses and courses and organizations staying within their remits, if member states of the UN choose to designate ecocide, then that would inform what we do. If it's an obligation that allies sign on to, but we are not a legal entity. It's not. It would be outside of our mandate to be a frontline actor there. Why don't I stop there?
I think that's great. Well, thank you all very much indeed. I'm very sorry. There's lots of questions on the chat. Maybe we can share those electronically with you, just to see the other questions that we would have liked to talk about if we had time. I'm sorry for those in the audience that we haven't been able to reach you. Maybe just for me, 4 things that I take away from this. One was, I think very clearly, the opportunities that exist in terms of decarbonisation. It is possible. It probably will be cheaper. Ultimately, we know that that's the way that society goes. So the quicker we move, the better, the less investment we make in redundant technologies. Coming very clear to me and online was the question about partnerships. And again, it's a societal change that is necessary, both in terms of mitigation and in terms of adaptation. Public sector, private sector, different government departments, and different other international institutions, we must all take up this challenge. The other thing that I heard very clearly was the new requirements for the military. And I think the point that you made was about how much more armies and military will have to look at sort of domestic activities. Forest fires, flooding, etc. All of these will be really, I don't think we can begin to understand the extent to which that will be front and center in terms of activities going forward. And that leads me on to my final question about sort of the new risks. And working with one of my colleagues here is trying to think about what does the world really look like in 2040 from a geopolitical perspective, but from a climate change perspective. This is a huge challenge for us really to get our head around, and the military, as everyone else, needs to really spend the time now to think about that and train the leaders for that time, because it really will be a different set of thinking that's necessary. So invite you all to read the report. Thank you all very much indeed for coming. The ambassador has to rush back to Brussels, so he won't be hanging around for questions, unfortunately, but if we could all thank them very much indeed, that would be great.